Hey scholars, this is a PowerPoint lecture video for chapters 3 and 12 for our public speaking textbook on using language, your voice, and your body for public speaking. On this PowerPoint, there's a few slides have some notes that I made that you can reference as I'm going through it. Hopefully it's useful to you. But like I said before, feel free to take notes within the actual PowerPoint presentation document, which is available on the same module as you're getting this video. So that's that. Pardon the hair today. It's the weather outside can make my hair quite unique and curly. Anyhow, that's that. Hope you're all doing well. So I'll get right into it. I recommend having your textbook open, of course, having the PowerPoint presentation open, taking lots of notes. You can always rewatch this, etc. So going on with the first slide 2 of the PowerPoint, it's effective delivery. Effective delivery is characterized by speech delivery is characterized by seeming natural and uncontrived. Contrived means like canned. It's so it sounds rehearsed, right? And it almost sounds like contradictory, right? You want to rehearse a bunch, rehearse, 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 rehearse. But when you actually perform your speech, you don't want it to sound rehearsed. You don't want it to sound like you've done this thing, rehearsed this thing 50 times. Just like in a job interview, right? If you're in a job interview and someone asks you a question like, why do you want to work for our company? Or what is something that you've done at your last job that you think is worth talking about during this interview? Assuming that that's something that you thought through already and you've practiced saying it, you don't want it to sound like you've rehearsed this, right? It doesn't mean that you're not going to get the job. It just comes off as sort of a, in terms of positive and negative, it comes off as a negative thing. It just sounds rehearsed, right? Contrived. So your speech should feel natural. And again, even if you feel like the stage fright and the public speaking anxiety, you feel that's inside of you, you should still be able to perform the speech such that you're being perceived as natural and uncontrived. That's the goal, right? And the only way you can sort of perfect that is by lots and lots and lots of practice and experience. So don't get hard on yourself. All that to say, like, don't get hard on yourself if you're giving your speech and you're watching one of the recordings and you're like, man, I sound a little bit contrived or a little bit unnatural. It's not like I have a box that says sounded unnatural, -5 points. That's all part of the whole way I grade, but that's the goal. All right. Remember that your goal is to help the audience to listen, understand, remember, and act. Meaning a persuasive speech. If I'm persuading you to do something, to think a certain way, to modify behavior, that's my goal, right? The speech should be structured such that by the end of the speech, during the speech, and at the end of the speech, you kind of feel motivated to act. And of course, building a sense of community, delivery, like the way I use language and words, like I can try to make the audience feel connected. You might just feel connected to the speaker. You might feel connected to the people around you if you're listening to a speech. That's all done through strategic language choices. And sometimes you've heard, you may have heard a speech from a politician, a famous person, an athlete, a musician, whoever, right? Someone who has a big public platform. You listen to this speech and you're like, wow, like, that was amazing. I feel so connected to whomever, right? A certain demographic. That's not random, and more than likely there's a team of people, a team of speechwriters writing that speech to create that outcome, the effect of feeling a sense of community. So your voice is, public speaking that's your, right? It's all about your voice. I highly recommend that you read through and practice the rhetorical workout on page 47 in our textbook, page 47, on chapter 3. This is something that's good to do like on a regular basis. You might just take a picture of this thing on your phone, the rhetorical workout, exercising your voice, and just practice, right? So much of public speaking is just it's about your voice, warming up your mouth, your tongue, your vocal cords, all the different things that are going on with what it takes to give a speech. So volume, you want to make sure that your volume is not too loud, not too soft. I had a few students who sometimes give a speech and like I can barely hear them, right? Like literally I can hardly hear them. and it's more of an issue in an online class if you're recording your speech. And if I have a if I have my volume all the way up and I still can't hear you, that's a problem. In a classroom, if I can't hear you, that's also a problem. I'll say like, hey, can you speak louder? Right? Your pitch, your rate, use of pauses. You don't want to speak too quickly. You don't want to be high pitched or low pitched when you shouldn't. You don't want to be high pitched when you should be low pitched. You want to have an appropriate pitch based on the content. Have an appropriate rate. You don't want to speak too quickly. You don't want to speak too slowly. If you speak so fast, such that I can't follow along, well, then I can't follow along, and it's hard to really know what you're talking about. If you speak so slow, it's also hard to follow along, and then I get lost in other thoughts. Use pauses strategically, effectively. Have intentional pauses. Even in your index in your index cards, you might even write on there. Those are for you, right? You're allowed to have for some speeches, you're allowed to have one. Some speeches, you're allowed to have two. Just write pause. You might write in like red letters, pause. Which, by the way, for index cards, one thing I'll talk about is the fact that over the years, a lot of students will have their own way of creating index cards. They write main point 1. They write their main points in blue ink. They write transitions in green ink, and they use a color coding system. Which actually, I was watching an episode of This Is Us with my wife, and then there's an episode where they were talking about how one of the characters, I can't think of his name, one of the characters, the way he would study was having color coding on his index cards. And I said to my wife, like, that's what I tell my students to do. And a lot of students have done it. So over the years, I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of index cards because I have students turn them in afterwards. And one common theme is having color coding systems. That helps you with, that's like aiding your voice. It's a positive aid in your voice, how to use your voice strategically so you don't get lost in the middle of your thought when you're looking at your index card. But using pauses, right? Inflection, pronunciation, articulation. Make sure the inflection of your voice doesn't sound like you're asking a question when you're supposed to be making a statement. And I have a video on the next slide, a link for you to click on that illustrates this in detail. Make sure you're pronouncing words correctly. If you're not sure how a word is pronounced, if you're not sure how to pronounce it, look it up. Nowadays, you look up a word, and on Wikipedia, a lot of times it'll just have that little icon that you can push the play button, and you'll hear a pronunciation of a word. Sometimes it's a person's last name. If you're citing a source and you're providing the information for the authors, you're like, I have no idea what this last name is. Choose one version of the pronunciation and stick with that. Don't say things like, say the person's name and then say, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced. When you do that, or let me ask you a question. What do you think happens? How do you think the audience responds when you say something like, I don't know how this is pronounced, but I think it's, or you say the thing and then you kind of look unsure and you're like, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced or something like that. The question is, what do you think the audience thinks? And part of it is there's a variety of responses. One is you're unnecessarily drawing attention to the fact, like for me, I'll just say, speak for my terms. If I say that, then what I'm doing is I'm unnecessarily drawing attention to the fact that I don't know how to pronounce something. And that's taking the focus off of the speech and more on the focus of something that is completely unrelated to the speech, the correct pronunciation of a unusual last name or a difficult sounding last name. So just choose one way of doing of pronouncing a word and stick with that if it's a word you'll use more than once. And then articulation. Make sure you articulate your words so you don't mumble. Enunciate so you don't mumble. Practice vocal warm-ups. So I have one. That next slide 5, is avoiding uptalk. So uptalk, if you're thinking, what's uptalk? I'd say nothing. What's up with you? Kidding. Dad humor. Dry sense of humor. So uptalk is when you are ending sentences with a certain inflection such that it sounds like you're asking a question when you're not. You're not asking a question, you're actually ending a sentence, but the way you're ending it makes it sound like you're asking a question and you're going on to something else. It's kind of strange. So I might say something like, the way it might sound is, Yesterday, my parents came over and I made some really good chili and I put vegetables in it and they really liked it. And that's how a lot of people talk, but it's not a good way to talk. At the very least, the issue is how it's perceived, right? You might say like, I talk like that and that's fine. And this is not an issue of judgment. The point is the way that it's perceived is that it's perceived negatively. There's negative associations with the use of uptalk, specifically in formal context. When you're with your friends, if you're with your friends, a group of friends or whatever, and you're hanging out and you're having a very informal conversation, you might not have the same perception. But when it's a formal setting like this class, you're giving a speech, then it's perceived more negatively. So avoid that. Watch that video. That video is from Dr. Alex Lyon. He's the communication coach. I have his whole website as a source on our course page. It's the YouTube communication coach. I forget how I have it. It's somewhere on our useful resources and documents. And this is one specific video that he has specifically on avoiding uptalk. Also, if you're a Family Guy fan, there's a I remember an episode years ago. There was an episode where Brian the dog was dating a girl who always used uptalk, and then the whole episode was about that. But anyways, this is a different video to help you understand that. Okay, so slide 6. I highly recommend that you try a variety of vocal warm-ups prior to when you begin rehearsing your speech. So when I say rehearsing your speech, you're going to have several sessions. You should have several sessions of speech rehearsals, right? You have a chunk of time in the day where you're like, all right, Tuesday at 10:30, I'm gonna do my speech rehearsals for 30 minutes, for an hour, whatever you're able to do. Prior to that, prior to when you actually begin rehearsing, do some vocal warm-ups. If you click the link on this video on slide 6, it's kind of it almost makes you feel silly, but the whole point is not that it's supposed to not sound silly. The whole point is that it's warming up your mouth, it's warming up your tongue, it's warming up your vocal cords and all the muscles that go into work with regards to your voice. Excuse me. If you go onto YouTube and you just type in vocal warm-ups or voice exercises, that kind of thing, you'll see tons. So find one that works for you. This one was unique, stood out to me. I liked it. And the next one. The next one is a very brief interview between Celine Dion and Larry King. And it's part of him interviewing her, but you'll hear there's the very small section where Celine Dion talks about some of the things that she still does after all these years of being a very successful, well-known singer. She still does voice warm-ups. So watch this video. It's interesting to see what like an actual professional does, a professional singer. These are the things that she still does on a daily basis, or at least when she's singing. So if you don't take it from me, take it from Celine Dion. Okay. So on to nonverbal delivery. So eye contact, or another way to think of it is eye behavior. So what are you doing with your eyes? Now, in a physical classroom, when I'm in a physical classroom, I'm looking at all my students. I'm looking at all my students on some sort of on a somewhat systematic basis. I don't choreograph it. It's not like, all right, look at Johnny for 2 seconds and then look at Natalie for 10 seconds, right? But you should be looking at everyone in your audience. Over the years, I've had some people say, oh, my high school teacher said that when I'm giving a speech, I should look at the tops of their heads, at the tops of the heads of the people in the class. Or my teacher said I should look at the back wall. Don't look at their faces, don't look at their eyes, look at the back wall. So imagine that I'm talking to you, but I'm looking like this. Imagine I'm right now looking, I'm talking face to face. Right now, I'm actually looking at the wall behind this computer screen. So obviously what you see is not me looking at you. I'm looking like above you or through you. It's very strange. So eye contact is important. Of course, what we talked about in this class is that your eye behavior should be primarily focused on the camera lens. And it's challenging because it's different, but that's kind of the whole point. Physical delivery is gestures, movement, and posture. You don't want to seem like a robot. You don't want to choreograph hand gestures, movement. It should feel natural. You should have a natural way of, excuse me, interacting with the audience. The antithesis of having a natural variety is being like completely straight. You're completely frozen. You're not moving at all. Your hands are at your sides, and it's strange. You're like a statue. You want to avoid that. You want to have, as much as possible, have a variety of gestures, hand gestures, facial movements, right? Moving your head around, moving your body around. You're going to be standing. You should. It's normal to be moving around a lot. I would say avoid pacing back and forth, because that would I would miss you in the camera screen. But it's normal to have some movement. It should come naturally. Think about the way you talk to your friends, right? You're with a group of friends and they said, "Hey Johnny, what'd you do last weekend?" I wouldn't just stand there and say, "I went to the movies last weekend with my friends. It was nice. We ate popcorn." And all kidding aside, that's sometimes I hear speeches that kind of come off that way. It's like that's not how people talk. The challenge is figure out the way you typically talk, and in terms of a comfortable movements with your body, and figure out how to continue that momentum into a speech. There should be some movement. Have natural gestures with your hands, your face, your body, and then of course your posture. You should be standing up straight. Don't slouch. Don't lean against things, but stand up straight. Have your knees bent. Shift weight between different legs so your legs don't fall asleep, or so you don't lose blood circulation to your brain. But standing up straight, of course, you're required to stand for our speeches. So stand up straight. Tight core. Think of one way to think of like posture is, imagine like you have like you're a puppet, and there's like a puppeteer. There's like a string attached to the top of your head, and they're like pulling up, right? So it's almost like this part of your head is trying to go straight to the ceiling. By the way, just the burn mark from grilling. I cook a lot, so hey, it's a burn mark. I'm okay. But yeah, try to almost like, not like this, but almost, you just think of like your head trying to go up, and what that does is it helps to train your body to just stand up straight. When you stand up straight, your voice sounds better, your body feels better, your blood is circulating better, and that's the way you should be standing in general. Facial expression. Make sure you have a variety of facial expressions. At the very least, your facial expressions should match the content of what you're talking about. If you're talking about something really exciting, you should look exciting. If you're talking about something more serious, you should look maybe a little more neutral, a little more stoic. If you're talking about something that's really sad or depressing, you don't have to contort your face to look strange, but at the very least, you should look neutral. I once had a student who gave a speech on something where she was talking about childhood poverty. This was over 10 years ago. But she was talking about childhood poverty, and this student happened to be sort of a naturally smiley student. She smiles a lot, which is great. I should smile more. I've been told I should smile more because that way people won't think that I'm angry as much. And I'm really not angry. It's just that I don't smile much. I'm just really neutral and stoic. But this student was really naturally smiley, and she was talking about childhood poverty. And during that portion of her speech, she was very smiley as she was talking about these horrible things with kids. And some people in the audience were kind of like, "Oh, wait, what? This is weird. Like, she's smiling, looks happy, but she's talking about something that's really, really depressing." I didn't grade her down for that. I didn't give her extra points either. But afterwards, I talked to her. I said, "Hey, that part of the speech when you talked about the childhood poverty and yada, 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 were you aware?" I said, "Were you aware of how your face looked?" And she's like, "No, because she's always smiling." And then I told her, I said, "Well, hey, while you were talking, you were smiling a lot." And I said, and then she's like, "I was? Oh my gosh." And she felt bad. And I said, "Don't feel bad, but just know like that's something to work on." And of course she wasn't happy. She wasn't in a good mood. She's just, that's her natural default sort of facial expression. So if your natural default facial expression is neutral, then try to modify it such that you have positive facial expressions for positive things and neutral facial expressions or more serious stoic facial expressions for either like neutral things or more serious or sad things, right? But you don't want it to look like you're scared stiff. If you just have no expression in your face, then it's really difficult to connect with the speaker. And of course, your appearance, you should look professional, somewhat professional. In our course, I don't in our public speaking course, I don't require you to go out and buy a suit and tie. You don't have to wear a formal outfit. But I'll talk more about clothing and whatnot with other speeches. But I highly recommend that you dress up. Dress up for what dress up is for you. If you just rolled out of bed, don't have that be your final presentation. Wearing a suit and tie or wearing something that looks kind of formal doesn't mean you're going to get a good grade. But in my experience of doing this for 15 years, what I have found is that the students who dress up, or it's obvious to me that they dressed for the occasion, whether or not they're wearing a suit and tie or like a really nice or a nice pair of pants, nice pair of jeans, a nice t-shirt or whatever, I can tell like, okay, they look like they dressed up for this assignment. They just tend to be more confident because when you go out of your way to dress up, it's like a tactile, physical, visual reminder. I'm doing this for something. It's a job interview. I'm wearing things I don't typically wear. I'm shaving extra better. I'm doing my hair extra better. Like I'm preparing for something, right? I want to make a good impression, and it tends to give you a confidence boost, which can definitely help with the performance of your speech. With practicing delivery, one thing to consider is to read your final draft outline aloud. Just when you're completely done with your outline, and I've mentioned this before, just read it out loud. What does it sound like? And then you can make some changes. Make some note cards. You should have several versions of note cards. The final note card or 2 note cards that you're using in your final speech, you should have already had several, right? The idea is you're using your note cards to figure out, okay, what are some key phrases, key terms that I can utilize, that I can look at while giving my speech, where I'm not going to use it as a crutch, right? The whole idea is I'm just having it there as a reminder. Maybe it's a source citation, maybe it's the title of a book or a person's name, or just short phrases. Don't write it out word for word. A lot of times it's like, you don't need to write out if you're telling a story about your most embarrassing moment, you don't need to write that out line by line. You know your most embarrassing moment story. So instead of outlining your most embarrassing moment story, you write Johnny's most embarrassing moment story. And it's like, boom, okay, yeah, I know that. I say that because sometimes when you've done your outline, you've practiced your speech, and then, all right, now the camera's on. Sometimes you have memory recall issues. Your memory doesn't work the same way because like I'm on stage and right, I'm being recorded. Again, the nice thing for this course is if you make a mistake, you're not satisfied with one version of your recording, you can do it over, right? Delete it and do it and start over. Practice the speech aloud several times. Try to simulate the public speaking experience. In other words, whatever you're doing and simulating the public speaking experience is kind of the same idea as giving your speech a dress rehearsal. So whatever you're going to do for your however you're going to record the final version of your speech in your kitchen, and you're going to set your phone in this particular area, and you're going to have the lighting in a certain area, that shouldn't be done only on your final version. Like you should do that a few times, right? To see what it's going to be like when I'm doing my final version. I want to be comfortable with that feeling. What I mean is oftentimes when you're practicing your speech, you might practice your speech in your car a few times. You might practice your speech as you're going on a jog. You might practice your speech as you're in other parts of your room or outside. But at some point you should try to rehearse your speech in this specific environment that you're going to be doing it for your final version. And of course, the more you practice, the more you can refine things and polish things and tie up loose ends, etc. All right, there's 4 methods of speech delivery, and I think we've already talked about these: manuscript, memorized, impromptu, and extemporaneous. What you're doing is extemporaneous. You're speaking from an outline without having the exact wording memorized. It's a blueprint, right? Extemporaneous is when you speak from an outline. It's like a blueprint for the speech. The actual speech is going to be a little bit different. There might be some grammatical errors in your actual speech, right? It's easier to make grammatical errors in a speech compared to writing. When you're writing, you see it right away. When you're speaking, you're not always consciously aware of the fact that you made a grammatical error in your spoken dialogue. I am when I am. I always know when I make a mistake, so it's kind of A sickness, I guess you might say. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so we're moving on to language. So if it seems like a drastic jump, right? We're on chapter 3, and then all of a sudden we're at chapter 12. I really wanted to focus on the things like the two most important things, right? Using your voice and your body, and also the way that you use words and the way that you use language. So language is on chapter 12. The authors talk about style and language. Style can be positive or negative. They said, hey, one style is you might be really informal. You have a lot of vocalized pauses. You use the like, you know. You might have long pauses. You might do things like, my next point. I've seen students do all kinds of things that are behaviors that are patterns which contribute to their style. One style being sounding unprofessional, unprepared, etc., etc. And maybe you were very prepared. Maybe you're so prepared, but then you might still give a speech such in a way that where certain negative behaviors are exhibited. It affects how people perceive you. It affects perceptions of your speech and perceptions of the actual speaker. Chapter 12 is on page 251 if you're following along in your textbook. 251. The authors give an example of perception of the speech. So the two examples they give are the federal government is the engine of our economic strength. It's like a metaphor, right? The federal government, engine of our economic strength. And that's not like a positive thing or a negative thing. That's providing basically a metaphor for understanding sort of the role of that federal government in terms of the economy. Maybe your speech goes on to talk about how there's bad things associated with it or positive things associated with it. But the point is that statement right there is the perception is that it's sort of neutral, right? If you said that in your speech, if I said that in a speech, you wouldn't know my feelings about the federal government and our economy. But if I said the federal government is a cancer destroying our independence, now you know how I feel about it. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, I totally agree. Or you're thinking like, wow, that's very unprofessional. Or like, I completely disagree with you, right? It definitely affects the perception of the speech. And then of course the speaker. The things that you say, the words that come out of your mouth affect the way that the audience thinks about you. So I have in the notes the language choices that you make, whether thoughtfully or not, will affect how your audience perceives and receives your message. And what I say is like sometimes you intentionally like you wanted to get a message across, but maybe it wasn't perceived well, or you said something sort of off the cuff, or you didn't really think through the consequences of using a certain phrase or an analogy or something, right? And the end result is negative perception. So be strategic and thoughtful with your language choices. So I'm on to slide 17 where it says using words well. You want to use specific, concrete words. Use word pictures, right? If I'm describing a dog, if I'm describing a dog and I said like, or if you ask me, hey, what kind of dog do you have? And I said, oh, it's just a small brown dog. If I said, I have a small brown dog, you're probably not going to think of the dog that's in that picture on slide 18, right? If I wanted you to form that image of that little dog on slide 18, I would need to be more specific. I would need to be more concrete. I need to use more vivid words. A small, cute, cuddly teacup Yorkie, small enough to fit inside of a little present box, etc., right? I can get really descriptive. That's not my dog, in case you're wondering. My dog is a large black and white Cajun mutt that we got from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, named Draper. Best dog I've ever had. Anyhow, and he has a cow print pattern of his fur. He's around here somewhere. At some point, you'll probably see him in one of the videos. Anyways, point is use very descriptive words. Use unbiased, appropriate language. Avoid any words that could be offensive or inappropriate or one-sided or unfair to your audience, right? Because keep in mind, your audience, as a public speaker, your audience doesn't really have an opportunity to disagree with you. They can disagree with you internally, but you don't want to use language and words that are going to like rub them the wrong way, because in a platform where it's one-way communication, I'm the speaker, you're the audience. It's not Q&A. You're here to listen to my message. If I'm using if I have poor choices in language, it can really kind of ruffle your feathers, and you're like, man, I really don't like that he said that. So keep that in mind. Vivid words, simple words too. You don't want to use a big word just for the sake of using a big word. Don't use a $10 word just for the sake of using a $10 words. Be simple. But sometimes you need to use a big word. Certain ideas and contexts call for the use of a more specific word, one that you might have to look up in a dictionary or a thesaurus. Make sure you're using the correct word on that note, on that segue into, like, make sure the words you're using are correct. And you can see some examples I put in the notes there. And then the authors talk about informality on pages 255 and 260. So they mention how oral style is a lot different from written style. Very few of us speak in complete sentences, and when we're speaking in conversation, we're not always observing or following the proper rules of grammar, syntax, tense shifts, subject pronoun agreement, etc., etc. You're thinking, what are all those words that he said? Fortunately, this is not a writing class or an English class, but the point is, our spoken dialogue doesn't always follow the way that we write. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a bad thing if your speech is peppered and cluttered and replete with really bad grammar. Then that's an issue. I say that to emphasize the importance of trying to maintain a formal style. Your speeches in this class are formal speeches for a college course in public speaking. As much as possible, you want to be formal. You can still personalize things and use first person, right? You're talking about yourself, and you can use humor and you can use irony or sarcasm, but you should still be formal. Avoid informality as much as possible, but don't beat yourself up when you're listening to a recording of your speech and you're like, oh man, I used the wrong tense, the wrong contraction there, or I used the wrong grammatical rule, or a subject pronoun disagreement, or I said in my speech. Oh my gosh. If you said once in a speech, that would be amazing. If you said it 200 times, that would also be amazing, but it would be amazingly bad. So don't beat yourself up, but the goal is to speak formally. Avoid words and things that are unnecessary. And keep in mind, extemporaneous speaking, right? The goal is not to write out your entire speech word for word and memorize that. The goal is to have a detailed, thorough outline for your informative and persuasive speeches, not for your introductory speeches, but for your informative and persuasive speeches, the idea is you have a very detailed, formal outline with good structure and following the assignment specifications, etc. But it doesn't need to be word for word of your speech. That's the outline, the blueprint. The speech is the finished product, right? And every time you rehearse that speech, it'll change a little bit, right? Sometimes your grammar might be off a little bit here and there. Sometimes you might have an informal thing that you say here and there. No big deal. But you don't need to memorize it, the outline. You need to memorize like the structure, the content, the things. You need to know what you're going to say. In other words, like, let's say you're about to give your speech, and if I took your outline from you, you should be able to tell me what your outline is. Maybe not every single word in your outline, because that'd be so much memorization. But if I said, okay, what are your main points? What's your attention getter? How are you going to transition from main point 1 to main point 2? You need to know that stuff. You don't have to know every single thing that I see on your outline, but you need to know where you're going prior to when you submit your final speech. Okay, defining terms. We're on to slide 20. We're almost done. It's really important to define terms for both the informative speech and persuasive speeches. You're playing the role of teacher, especially for an informative speech, and for your introductory speeches, you're still playing the role of teacher, but it's more the introductory speech. The focus of that is more on just you sharing about yourself. But if you use terms that are unfamiliar to the audience, you need to explain them. But that's especially the case for your informative and persuasive speeches. You play the role of teacher. You need to define things, explain things, illustrate things, make connections to ideas the audience understands, right? The goal is to try to get us to understand your topic. You're the expert on that topic. At least you should be, right? You can assume that you know more about this topic than anybody else. Right? I think sometimes students they underestimate the fact that they just sometimes falsely assume the audience is somewhat familiar with your topic. Even if the audience is somewhat familiar with your topic, it's not usually the case that every single audience member is very familiar with your topic. Maybe a couple people are, but assume that they don't know anything about your topic. That's the point of you giving a speech. You're there to enlighten us. Even for topics that are familiar, right? If you're going to give a speech on a person, and if you know that most people in the audience they know who that person is, or if it's like a place, or if it's an event, or it's an object, a familiar object to us all, you might think, yeah, they know a lot about it. Maybe, but your goal is to give us novel information. What don't we know about it? What are the things that are the hidden mysteries of your topic that make your speech interesting and unique and novel? What are you bringing to the table, right? So that's your goal as a teacher. Also, the authors talk about how it's important to limit your jargon and also define technical terms. Those two things kind of go hand in hand. Consider your audience. So when you're talking about jargon, jargon's not a bad word. I think it comes off as a bad word. Like you were using jargon in your speech. I was? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. No, well, jargon's not a bad thing. Jargon is basically like jargon terms are terms that are specific to any particular entity. An easy way to understand that is in sports. If you played sports, you probably have jargon terms that are specific to your sport. In baseball, there are jargon terms that are specific to baseball. In certain work industries, there's certain jargon terms that are specific to, let's say, the restaurant industry. If you worked in restaurants, I mentioned before, I worked in restaurants. I worked in 6 different restaurants over the course of 8 years. I did food server, host, busser, bartender, trainer, did all those things. And there's lots of terms and phrases that are specific to that industry, where if you're an outsider looking in, you might kind of have an idea of what we're talking about, but for the most part, you probably don't fully know. For speech, if you're going to use jargon terms, like your primary goal when using the terms is to get the audience to understand the relevance of that term to your topic, and you do that by explaining. If I said something like in restaurant example, oh, one night I was so busy and I got triple sat at the same time, and I was slammed, and I was whatever the terms might be. I was in the weeds. I remember when I first got a job in the restaurant, they actually gave us a list of these terms. These are some terms that are specific to being a food server. In the weeds, it means that you're really busy. But if I wanted to really get you to understand it, I have to really explain those things. So adapt your topics, adapt your messages to your audience. You want to avoid the audience getting lost in translation. If you're using lots of technical terms and jargon terms that are specific and familiar to certain industries or entities or whatever, I'm going to be lost, right? Unless if you're talking about baseball, like if I know a lot about baseball, which I don't, I'm lost. I don't know what you're talking about. I once had a student give a speech on baseball, and man, like a very, very large percentage of his speech was centered around baseball jargon. And if the room were filled with baseball players, then they'd probably be like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. But assume that the audience is not all baseball players. The audience is college students, where there might be some baseball players, but you have to make your message adaptable for a general audience, appropriate for a general audience. Assume the audience is not familiar with your topic. Like I said, you're the expert, enlighten us. The authors talk about rhythm, stress and rhythm. So rhythm plays a powerful role in how your audience receives your message. You want to avoid not having any rhythm, is just being monotone. So we want to avoid having a monotone delivery, a computer-esque delivery. You don't want to sound like you're a computer. Frankly, I've heard those computerized AI voices talking about things like you push if it's a definition of something, you hit play, and then you hear this like automated computer generated voice defining something or explaining something. And there's part of me that says, wow, That's totally a computer, but it sounds like a real person. But it's obvious that it's a computer. Avoid sounding like that because you're not a computer, you're a human. All that to say, I've heard several speeches where the student, it sounds worse than that. Or rather, it's just their speaking is just completely monotone. There's no inflection, no change in the rate, no change in the pace, no change in the volume. It's just one constant. And you want to avoid that. And I really want to, my message to you is not to focus on what should I avoid, but focus on what can I do? What can I incorporate? What are the good things that I can do? I have a TED Talk that I posted on my YouTube page that talks about the ways that we can eat there's certain foods that have certain properties that can have a positive effect on cancer, such that it can prevent cancer. It can potentially cure cancer. It can, if you already had cancer and you follow certain dietary rules, it can prevent it from coming back. And that's a very shortened version of this very detailed, dense, meaty TED Talk, which is 20 minutes long. It's on my YouTube page. What the doctor talks about, though, is, hey, he basically says this. He said, don't focus so much on what to avoid. And this is consistent with other documentaries. Well, there's one documentary called Forks Over Knives. And in that documentary, they kind of have the same sort of logic. You know, eating a plant-based whole foods diet as a way to improve your health, to prevent things from happening, to cure your body from certain types of medical conditions. The focus is not like, what should I avoid? What should I take off? What should I omit from my diet? The focus is on, what can I add? What are all the good, positive things that I can add to my diet that are going to make me feel better? So, similar to that, analogous to that, for public speaking, these chapters 3 and 12, it's like a toolbox. There's so much information on how to speak properly and how to speak competently, how to have good rhythm and good style and all those things. There's so much information in here. The focus should be on, what can I utilize from this toolbox? What can I pull from these chapters, from this whole textbook, from this toolbox? What can I utilize and pull from these things to make my speech better for me, for my purposes, and what the assignment is? So that's what I want you to focus on for public speaking for our class and moving forward. I have a real brief video illustrating stress and rhythm as it kind of relates to what's in the textbook. You can watch that video. You'll see what I'm talking about. This is especially helpful for non-native English learners, regardless of your English language proficiency, whether you're native or non-native. It's always good to have a refresher course on just the anatomy of the English language. And then that last slide where it says rhythm for main ideas, we'll have another chapter. I think it's chapter 10 on organizing your main ideas. This is another way to understand rhythm in terms of the speech. So what this is called here for the main points. So you have a topic. The idea is like, how do I structure my main points? Right. What you see right here is the topic is Ida Wells Barnett. If you're going to give a speech on a person, one way to structure main points is through what's called parallel structure. Main point 1, main point 2, and main point 3. They all have the same beginning. As a teacher, as a journalist, as a civic organizer. Each main point begins with an emphasis, a stress on the person's role, right? As a teacher, this person did this. As a blank, this person did this. And then the supporting points would all directly relate to that role. It makes it easier for you, the speaker, to develop ideas and whatnot. So that's a lot of stuff on using your voice, your body, how you use and utilize language and style to create various perceptions of your speech, and of course yourself as a speaker. So it's a lot. I know that was a lengthy, sort of long-winded lecture, but I really wanted to emphasize this because public speaking is you using your voice in specific ways. So that's that. Hope you're doing well, and I will talk to you later. Bye.